A couple of weeks ago, I published a review of two plugins from a developer called Red Rock Sound, one compressor and one EQ, both emulations of hardware units. And those two plugins were unique in that they were targeting immersive audio production. And they were doing certain things in certain ways that no other plugin is doing. So I was generally very excited about those plugins, but I had a couple of suggestions. Now, as it turns out, the developer actually watched my video and implemented some of those suggestions. So I felt that it's time to revisit those plugins. So let's have a look. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I'm a digital media educator with more than 30 years of experience in higher education. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio, and today about two very interesting plugins. Now, if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below, or there's also a QR code here somewhere. The two plugins I want to talk about today are, first of all, the EQP1A Immersive from Red Rock Sound, which is a Pultec emulation with an immersive twist. And then we have the Comp609, also from Red Rock Sound, which is a British Class A compressor emulation, also with an immersive twist. And the one thing that I didn't mention last time I reviewed those plugins was that they are really inexpensive. So at the moment I'm recording this, they were on sale for $15 each, and they're actually on sale quite often. So if you're interested in those plugins, just wait for a sale and you can get them very, very cheap. Before I get started, two quick disclaimers. First of all, this is not a sponsored video. I purchased these plugins myself. I also didn't have any communication with the developer until after my first video, and even then all the communication that we had was primarily them telling me that they implemented a couple of updates. So nobody had any influence on what I'm going to say, nobody saw this video in advance. Everything that I'm going to talk about is strictly my own opinion. Second of all, I'm not a professional audio engineer, and I'm therefore not going to talk about how well these plugins emulate their respective hardware units. This is not my main expertise. My expertise is on the user experience side of things, especially when it comes to immersive audio production. However, I would be really interested to learn more about the quality of those plugins from the emulation perspective. So if you have some thoughts about that, please leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd really be interested to learn more. And with that being said, let's get into our little project. Now, I'm going to work with Cubase today, and I'm going to work on a Windows machine. However, the plugins work on a Mac as well as on Windows in exactly the same way. The only thing you really need is a digital audio workstation that can handle immersive audio, because once again, we are interested in the immersive audio capabilities of those plugins. And we are going to work with Ambisonics today, primarily with Ambisonics. And we're going to use Ambisonics as a basis for some spatial mid-side processing, which is a technique that I've showed in a couple of other videos. Links in the description below. But let's not talk too much. Let's hear what we have here. Now, essentially, I keep things as simple as possible. I have a synth loop here. And what I did with the synth loop is that I upmixed it to 7.1.4. So there's a 7.1.4 group track here. And on this group track, I'm keeping a instance of NewGen Halo upmix. And this upmix plugin essentially takes the stereo that comes out of the loop and essentially turns that into 7.1.4. And we're going to kind of work with that a little, and we're going to shape it a little and kind of maybe widen it a little. And in order to show a little bit the sidechaining capabilities of the compressor, I've also included some drums. So I have an additional drum loop here, which is very, very simple. And together, I think they sound reasonably okay. As I mentioned before, I'm going to use the Ambisonics version of that audio in order to do some manipulation in a three-dimensional space. So I'm going to use the two plugins from Red Rock Sound in order to do some spatial mid-side processing, which is a technique that I used in some of my previous videos. Once again, links in the description below. Now for that, what I need to do is I need to convert the 7.1.4 track into an Ambisonics track. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a group track, which is a Ambisonics track. And let's call that spatial mid-side, because we are going to, once again, do some spatial mid-side processing here. So let's add the track. And let me just kind of turn off the solo buttons here. And then I'm going to route the 7.1.4 into our Ambisonics track. And as always, what I usually do when it comes to that point is I'm switching out the Ambisonics decoder from the standard Cubase decoder to the Audio Brewer's decoder, because once again, that is a decoder that I really like because it shows us all the channels and all the three-dimensional information that we need. And as always, in order to make sure that I also get the correct signal, I'm going to switch the decoder from automatic mode to third order Ambisonics mode. That makes sure that I'm also getting the correct information. So let's just have a brief listen on what we have so far. Now, since we are now converting that into Ambisonics, the signal is a little quieter. So let me just kind of bring that back to, I think if we just turn that back, it's fine. Yeah. So let's use the RedRock sound plugins in order to do some manipulation in the Ambisonics domain. And for that, I need to add an instance of them to our Ambisonics track. So let me just first close that. And let's open up the track here and let's add an instance. Let's start with the EQ. So this is the EQP1A, which is once again a Pultec emulation. So here you have the typical Pultec controls, not going to talk about those. I'm primarily really interested in the user interface here on top. Now, if you've seen my first video, you might notice that this has actually changed a bit. In the original version, there were only 6 buttons here. So you only had the possibility to select between 6 different channels or channel groups. And there's also an edit button here. So this essentially means that we can now actually edit the type of channel configuration that we have. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. But what is the basic idea here? The basic idea here is that this is not only one EQ, this is actually a series of 4 EQs. So these EQs can be selected with the FX selection here. And the idea is that you then decide for each of those EQs which channels this EQ is going to act on. And this allows us to separate out the EQ settings for the individual channels. And in an Ambisonics signal in particular, we can, for example, have one EQ that acts on the mono signal, and we can have one EQ that acts on the first order Ambisonics signals, and one EQ that acts on the second order Ambisonics channels, and one EQ that acts on the third order Ambisonics channels. And this is primarily what we're going to do in order to shape our sound a little. Now, one of the things that I complained about in the original version was that because we only had 8 channels that could be selected, I couldn't really use that for a third order Ambisonic signal, which needed 16 channels really. So now we have 16 channels, so we can actually apply that plugin to our third order Ambisonic signal just fine. The only thing that we need to do is we need to configure these channels, and we need to tell the plugin what channel configuration we want. Now, in the input routing, the plugin now has a couple of additional options, and if you open that up, you actually see that you have different settings that you can select. And there's also another section where you have additional settings as well. But what you can do in addition to that, you can actually create your own setting. So if you click on the edit button here, you can essentially give every channel a name and then save that back into the settings, and that will allow you to create your own channel mappings. Now, what I want to do here is I want to map that onto an Ambisonic signal, and the type of mapping or the type of naming convention that I'm going to use is essentially the same naming convention that is also used in the decoder that I'm using, the Audio Brewer's decoder. So here we have sort of this naming convention, which is a naming convention you generally don't see very often, but I kind of like it because it gives you a little bit of an idea of what actually these channels are for. So in particular for the first order channels. So here we have the W for the essentially the first channel, which is the mono channel. And then we have the Y, Z, and X channels, which are representing the side channels in Y direction, in Z direction, and in X direction. And I think that that is really kind of useful to have it named that way. Now, I've already done that in advance, and let me just load that up here. I've solved it here under other, called Ambisonics. So we have these additional channels now, W, Y, Z, X, and then it goes on until P. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select the channels that I'm going to map to those 4 effects channels. So I'm going to map the first one to the first EQ. I'm going to deselect it here. I'm going to then kind of go to the second one, and I'm going to use the first order channels, which are Y, Z, and X. And then I'm going to the third one. I'm going to select the second order Ambisonics channels, which are the next 5, and then the final one are the last 7, which are the third order Ambisonics channels. And that essentially means that I now have 4 EQs in sequence. The first EQ is acting on the mono signal. The second EQ is acting on the first order side channels. So this is the traditional stereo side channel, and then the vertical and the depth side channels. Then the second order Ambisonics channels, so I usually call them second order side channels, and then the third order side channels, and we can then essentially kind of control them individually. So let's just play around with that a little and see what we can do with it. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to mute the drums, because the drums aren't really routed into the upmix track, so they're actually separated. They're just kind of in stereo, and I'm going to bring them in later in order to demonstrate how the side chaining works. But for the moment, let's just disable those. So let's just start, and let's disable the drums. So we now only have the synth. The synth one again is upmixed to 7.1.4, is then kind of converted into Ambisonics, and from Ambisonics it runs into the Red Rock Sound equalizer here. Now, one thing that we can do, for example, and that's always one thing that I do, is that we might want to attenuate the low end in the higher order or in the side channels of the Ambisonics signal. So if we go into the selection second here, which is the first order Ambisonics channels. So let's just attenuate the low end here maybe, and maybe boost the high end a bit. What that will essentially do is it will broaden the image a bit. So this will bring out the image on the sides. Let's maybe do the same thing for the second order and third order channels. So also attenuate the signal, maybe even more than that, and boost the high ends somewhat. And we can boost it at different frequencies. So let's boost it at 5 kHz, for example. Let's go to the third order channels. Let's do the same thing here. Also boost, and let's also do that at 5. And maybe let's bring the third order back a bit. And what we can also do is we can maybe increase the first order channel slightly. That will also broaden the image a bit. And then we lost a little bit of low end, so what we can do is we can go into the mono channel and maybe boost the mono signal at the low end. And I'm going to exaggerate a bit so that we have some, that we essentially hear something. And we might need to kind of increase the frequency because there's not that much going on at 30 Hertz. Yeah. That sounds pretty nice. So as you can see, there are a lot of options here. Now what we've done here is very similar to what we did with the Tone Boosters EQ 2 weeks ago. However, because it's a Pultec emulation, the effect is a lot more subtle. It's not as dramatic as we had with the Tone Boosters EQ, but it's still a very nice way to shape the three-dimensional nature of your sound. And, you know, kind of you can do that with a hardware emulation, which I think is a really cool thing to do. So let's also have a look at the second plugin, which is a compressor. So let me just close that here and let's go back into our channel settings and let's add an instance of the RRS compressor. And this essentially is a British Class A emulation. And let's maybe close that window here. We don't need that. And it works in exactly the same way with a couple of minor differences. So the first thing is we also have this channel selection, which goes up to 16 channels. We have the effect selection, which allows us to do 4 compressors in a row. 1, 2, 3, 4. And we can select what type of input routing we want, and we can also edit the type of input routing we want. Now, in addition to that, we also have the option to kind of enable sidechaining, and we're going to do that in a second. But let's first kind of switch that over to Ambisonics. And for that, we also, once again, need to edit a kind of a setting. So we need, it doesn't really come automatically with an Ambisonics channel layout. You actually do have to do that yourself. And you can simply do that by kind of putting in here the names of the individual Ambisonics channels. Now I've already done that in advance, so let me go in here under other. I have here other Ambisonics, and that gives me this particular kind of channel layout, and I'm going to do the same thing that I also did with the EQ. So I'm going to map the first one, which is the mono channel, to our first compressor. I'm going to go over to the second compressor. I'm going to select the first order Ambisonics channels, which once again are the first order side channels. I'm going to go to the third one. I'm going to select the second order Ambisonics channels, which once again are the second order side channels. And then the last one, which are the last 7. And those are the third order Ambisonics channels, or as I call them, the third order side channels. So let's also play around with that a little. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the audio. And let's maybe go into the third order channels, and let's maybe, I don't know. I mean, there are no rules, quite frankly. We can do whatever we want. So let's just compress them. It's probably not going to have a big effect because... But what it can do is we can also change the makeup game. This also allows us to bring in more of the third order channels or less of the third order channels. And we can actually see that here in the decoder option. So if I'm kind of increasing the makeup, I essentially see the third order channels coming in. Let's maybe reduce that a little. Let's go to the second order channels. Let's do the same thing. Let's maybe compress a bit more. I don't know. Whatever floats your boat. There are no rules once again. Now let's do one thing maybe, and let's kind of use our side chaining in order to kind of get the kick kind of pumping a little. And I'd like to do that primarily with the mono channel because it's primarily kind of depending on the low end, quite frankly. So let's open up the side chaining here. And let's add as a sidechain source the drums here. And let's maybe enable the drums. So they are currently muted. So let's unmute them. And let's engage the filter here. And let's engage the side channel. And it's now reacting to the kick. And let's compress that so that we get a little bit more of the low end. Let's do the same thing for the first order channels. So that's also, as you can see, you can actually individually engage the side chaining, or if you, essentially depending on if you want to have the side chain on that particular set of channels or not. So let's engage the side chaining here. And let's do the same thing. Let's put the filter up. Let's make it a little bit more extreme maybe. Increase the ratio. That's maybe a bit much. And then now we lost a little bit of the width, so let's bring up the makeup gain a little. And that is actually pretty nice. So let's kind of see how that sounds with or without those plugins. So this was the compressor. So as you can see, kind of we brought a little bit of more of the side information. This was primarily because we increased the makeup gain of the first order channels. And this is the original signal. So once again, the original one. And then we engaged the EQ in order to kind of shape the three-dimensional sound a bit. And then we also engaged the compressor in order to do a little bit more. And also do a little bit of side chaining. And it sounds pretty nice. So as you can see, a lot of options for shaping the three-dimensional nature of our sound. I think what Red Rock Sound have done here is they've taken an already interesting plugin concept and made that even better by extending it to 16 channels and by allowing us to create custom channel configurations. I think this is really, really neat. And this makes this a very powerful plugin. And once again, these plugins are not particularly expensive, so I definitely recommend checking them out. And if you have any thoughts about the quality of the emulation, I would really like to hear about those things. So please use the comment section below, or once again join my Discord community to leave your comments there. But this is really everything I wanted to say today. And with that being said, see you at the next video.